Here is a list of the last 5 mice that I've spent significant time with. The HTX Pro, the M2K, the Keychron M4, the HCKP, and the Titan 1. I've loved trying out creative mice with weird but functional design philosophies, and so many of them have gotten me to think, maybe I could main this. But I always go back to the HTX Pro. It's been about a year and 2,000 hours of gameplay since I considered the HTX Pro my main, not because I felt like swapping would hurt some muscle memory I've built up, I just didn't prefer any of the fingertip options I tried and aimed the best with the HTX. And yet, the first mouse in years that I've considered maining over the HTX Pro is this. It's an unassuming mouse. Aside from a few physical features, it doesn't have too much that's peculiar about it, especially compared to the mice I mentioned earlier. In terms of dimensions, it's much more akin to standard mice that the majority of FPS players use. It doesn't really make sense that I, somebody who has dedicated themselves to fingertip mice and weird innovations, would find this mouse so compelling. But the HTX Mini has become one of my go-to recommendations for fingertip grip. It opens up some options to become even more versatile than any pure fingertip mouse, and has a unique use case that, regardless of grip, makes this mouse interesting. To understand this, we should quickly talk about what makes pure fingertip mice good at what they do. For me, the goal of fingertip mice is to have your fingers generally play a larger role in your aim. Instead of just having them be utilized for fine adjustments, they can become involved in everything. Acceleration and deceleration of all kinds, tension management, flicks, you name it. These tiny mice achieve this in 3 ways. The first is size. Smaller objects just allow for more range of motion for actually manipulating the mouse, and losing the back half of the mouse allows you to pull down much further than you would with a full-size mouse. The second is weight. Because they're so small and you don't need half the mouse, these mice start to get absurdly light, like 20 to 30 grams light. You might feel that this is an unnecessary level of optimization, but when a relatively weak muscle group is the only contact point you have with the mouse, the weight difference is far more noticeable. You'll naturally use your fingers more to maneuver this mouse when it requires less effort, and you'll become less fatigued over time. And honestly, lighter is just always better. And the third is grip width. I'm including this separately from size because I think it plays a very specific role in the HTX and the M4. Having the mouse be so small and thin makes the mouse feel like you're articulating a pen, a precise tool that your fingers manipulate to create fine motions. This one has some upsides and downsides, which we'll talk about in a moment. So with that in mind, let's turn our focus back to the HTX Mini. While it does have more normal dimensions, it is still a bit odd. Here's it compared to the original HTX. This HTX was already considered a great fingertip mouse because of its low hump and low weight, and the HTX Mini takes this even further, shortening it significantly. The Mini version is only 27 grams, which is the lightest full-size mouse in the market, and actually lighter than my HTX Pro. Its length isn't as extreme as normal fingertip mice, but still offers you a very solid range of motion. So that's both of the first 2 reasons to use a fingertip mouse already, leaving us with just the grip width. It doesn't look that obvious in elo shapes, but this side curvature is quite aggressive, and I actually found that really useful. It makes the perceived grip width tighter, it offers great support for the pinky, and the mouse never feels like it wants to slip out of your hand. But it is still a very wide mouse. The OP1 was noteworthy for being very similar in length to the XM1, but much thinner, and the HTX Mini is kind of the opposite. It's quite similar width to the original HTX, but just scaled down vertically. So now let's talk about what that pen-like grip actually does, and whether or not this larger grip width is a deal breaker. With the HTX Pro, my fingers are undoubtedly more active in my aim than with the HTX Mini, and it's mostly because of grip width. For anything very fine tracking heavy, or games where I want the most control over my acceleration, I tend to prefer that. But something with the HTX that has always been harder than full-size mice for me is arm engagement. I encountered a very strange feeling when I tried switching back to the HTX Pro after a week with the HTX, where I had to go for a close range track and I felt an insane amount of mental resistance to moving my arm for it. For things like tracking people taking jump pads, when I need more range of motion than my wrist can provide, or generally if I'm performing a task that the arm is better at, it's nice to be able to effortlessly switch to using my arm for aiming. I always knew it was something that was a bit harder with the HTX, And I'm not totally sure if it's just the grip width, or maybe it's having a slightly more even weight distribution within the hand. But with the HTX, arm engagement is much, much easier, even when in full fingertip. Now, I still naively think that it's something you could train and get really good at with the HSK Pro 2, but it's undoubtedly more difficult, both to do subconsciously and to get good at it. If that was the only differentiating factor, it would be a pretty simple use case. Stability and arm engagement versus mobility and maximized finger engagement. But there's another benefit that you get from a slightly longer mouse. Palm contact. Touching your hand to the back of the mouse for extra stability. And I get it. I'm a traitor to the fingertip playstyle. We don't want palm contact. But hear me out. This mouse is the first one that has let me experiment with something that I've thought about for a long time. A claw fingertip hybrid grip. It's in this perfect Goldilocks zone where I almost never run into the mouse when I'm using in true fingertip, but it's not hard at all to engage palm contact if I need the stability buff. With other mice like the original HSK, I could do claw or I could do fingertip. But switching was too much of a reach for it to be feasible to switch dynamically, and small mice like the OP1 were still a bit too long for a pure fingertip to feel comfortable. It also allows me to do something similar to what many people liked about the OP1, have pretty solid fingertip range of motion while maintaining palm contact. The combination of these two traits allows for very seamless switching and allowed me to toy with degrees of mobility and stability that I found surprisingly intuitive to play with. Honestly, there's nothing too negative I have to say about the quality of life with this mouse. Before I did a firmware update, I was having awful pixel skipping, but that's fixed now. The sensor performance is solid and has up to 8K. The battery life is impressive for this weight. The build quality is pretty good, especially by gwolves standards. There's only one detail that has me scratching my head as to what to think about it ever since I got it. The sensor position. Turn over your mouse and take a look at where the sensor ring is. For the vast majority of you, it should be right in the center of the mouse, where your thumb tends to end up. But on the HTX Mini... Wait, what? Okay, for those of you who go outside, I should quickly explain what different sensor positions actually do. Imagine the sensor is at the base of my palm here. If I were to move the mouse with only my wrist, this is the distance it would cover. If the sensor was further up on the mouse, like here, this is the distance it would cover. Basically, the further forward the sensor position is, the faster wrist-based movements will be. Fingertip-driven movements are basically not affected at all, and arm-based movements only minimally. It really depends on where you grip the mouse with the HTX Mini, but in general, it should make wrist-based movements feel faster across the board. Some people love this. They think of it like a feature like Mouse Excel, where you can choose to make certain physical movements translate to faster on-screen movements. And I do think my fast, wrist-driven flicks felt a bit more consistent and made them with slightly higher confidence when I was really used to this. And surprisingly, it wasn't that hard to get used to. I've gone on record to complain about the Keychron M4's slightly odd sensor position before, but for some reason, the HTX Mini was shockingly intuitive. The only time I'd have issues is when I'd switch between the HTX and the HSK within a single session. One of the two would usually feel quite strange, specifically for wrist-based flicks. But if you just main this mouse and see what is essentially a faster wrist sensitivity as a benefit, this is a peculiar but very potent use case for this mouse. It is still an incredibly competent claw mouse for small hands, so even if none of my points about fingertip mice swayed you at all, this is a separate use case of its own. The last noteworthy thing about this mouse is the clicks, and it's mostly because one of the most annoying aspects of the HSK and other fingertip mice was that the clicks on those mice were heavier than basically every other mouse in my collection. When you have a mouse that light and a grip that unstable, the weight and positioning of the clicks matters quite a lot actually. You'll find that keeping your crosshair completely steady, especially on fast surfaces like glass, becomes exceedingly hard when it takes that much force to press down mouse 1. It can contribute to the mouse feeling like it's being pushed out of your hand and adds a bit of extra grip tension. The HTX Mini's clicks do a few things right. The biggest one is weight, of course. They're much lighter and much easier to press, but there's also the height of the clicks. Click height was another factor that made the HSK Pro feel so precise, and I'm glad they carried over that design philosophy here. Your fingers end up quite close to the pad, though this effect is less prominent the smaller your hands are. And then there's the click grooves, inward sloping clicks that both lower the click height further and make your fingers feel more locked in without being restrictive. It's a really comfortable experience, and it's something I'm surprised isn't on more mice. So there's just one more question left for me to answer. Will I main this mouse? I honestly don't know. Fingertip engagement is such a big part of my style, and I feel like I should lean into the unique aspects of what makes me a decent FPS player. But arm-based movements have been a weakness of mine for quite a while now, and the HTX feels like it could let me solve them. I think that if this thing was 10 to 20% thinner where I grip it, it might be my perfect mouse. But as it stands, the HTX Mini has created a few small issues with the skill set that I've developed, namely with deceleration. There's a much more noticeable delay between my flicks and my micros compared to the HSK because of my fingers playing with a smaller role in my aim due to the width. This is definitely something I could train, get better at engaging my arm during flicks and still have some tension budget to play with my wrists and my fingers. And then maybe I'd have the best of all three worlds. I don't know. I might like my HSK too much for the way I play right now, but an HTX Super Mini might be my endgame. I think that's basically everything I want to talk about with this mouse. Though I should provide a disclaimer that gwolves is kind of an awful company. I love the mice they make. They come up with some really innovative stuff, and 2 of their products are my favorite mice ever. But support is god awful. Like, is this email not insane? If you have a dysfunctional copy, tough luck. You likely aren't getting replaced. In my experience, I've had 2 scroll wheels break on me, though I put thousands of hours into both of those mice. But aside from that, I had no real issues with my other 7 gwolves products that I've used. So yeah, get one at your own risk. But if you do, use code viscose at checkout. Support our favorite aimer. Thanks for watching.